and welcome to the Hindu's weekly podcast called Parley. I'm Jagriti Chandra, this week's host, and we are discussing whether pro-natalist policies or asking couples to have more babies is the best way of addressing population aging. Last month, Andhra Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu urged people in southern states to have more children to counter rapid aging in these states, which he said was exacerbated by young people migrating to different states.
భవిష్యత్తులో మీ ఇంట్లో ఎక్కువ మంది ఉంటేనే ప్రభుత్వ సహాయం కూడా ఎక్కువగా ఉంటుంది.
He also spoke about the need to devise incentives for couples to encourage more babies. A few days later, Tamil Nadu Chief Minister M.K. Stalin questioned why couples should have a small family while expressing concerns over delimitation and diminishing representation for southern states in parliament. And he even suggested why there shouldn't be as many as 16 children. To demystify these concerns, we have with us Professor Gita Sen from the Public Health Foundation of India, as well as Udaya Mishra, Honorary Professor for International Institution for Migration and Development at Trivandrum. Thank you so much, Gita and Udaya, for joining us for this podcast. I will begin with you, Udaya, first. If you could give us an overview of what is the population growth trajectory of the country as a whole, and what are the regional disparities within India? We know that while the total fertility rate for India as a whole is at replacement level of 2.1, meaning population stabilization, there are also variations from one state to another. Just help us set the national and regional context on population development.
This problem of relating population growth with the attained replacement level of fertility has been actually confusing a lot more than otherwise. Population growth in India, though has slowed down, Indian population will keep on growing till the year 2070 as of now, whereas the world population will keep on growing till the year 2080. So where we are actually behind is that actually 2070 is early for India to have population keeping on growing. The reason behind the trajectory of population growth in India is its population momentum. Because I must elaborate here for you what is population momentum means. The past high fertility and the past cohort of people who come into reproductive ages over time, although the fertility declines, they still contribute significantly to the quantum growth in population. The replacement level of fertility which is attained today is sounded like we have attained replacement fertility, therefore immediately there will be an impact on population growth. The replacement level of fertility attainment is an indication of the fact that we have reached a level of fertility, theoretically, actually in terms of total fertility rate, which is neither any woman's real completed fertility level. The total fertility rate is indicative of the fact that in terms of fertility, that is in terms of replacement reproduction, only every woman is getting replaced by another woman. But that does not in any way say that India's population growth is going to be immediately getting stabilized or immediately going to experience a negative growth rate. Having said that, I must also elaborate for you as to what is the birth and death rate transition in India, which will give you the outcome of growth rate that exactly till 2060 and 70 in between, the death rate will cross the birth rate curve. And therefore, the growth rate continues to persist. But the regional pattern of growth rate of India's population has been completely different. There is a north-south divide for which we, myself and with my co-authors, we have drafted a book called Demographic and Development Divide in India. So demographic divide in India is strictly significant in terms of a north-south divide. The southern states are much ahead in this process, whereas the northern states are behind. However, the population growth in these states are of slower order in southern states. However, the age composition of the population continues to remain in a manner that it can sustain the population. And I would come to say that there are two concerns which needs to be highlighted. One is sustaining the population, another is the federal representation. These are two different things because sustaining the population is in terms of the working age population, non-working population, the population age structure and composition, but federal representation is in terms of share of the population of a state to the total national total. And in that concern, there has to be some rethinking to be made to actually address this concern. And in this way, in this regard, I had done some kind of a work with the last Finance Commission where we added demographic performance to be included in the reading of the population share.
So, can you explain the difference between demographic performance as well as perhaps demographic numbers?
Yeah. When we say demographic performance is in terms of the attainment of stabilization of population at large. When we say demographic performance, reduction in fertility, increasing longevity gives rise to an age structure of the kind which we see in demographic transition process. And demographic performance largely highlights how fast, how quickly, in what manner do we reduce fertility, and its response is seen in terms of rising longevity. So, demographic performance is not one sided. Demographic performance is to read reduction in fertility as well as increase in longevity. In both regards, what is the performance that states are doing, and that we rate in terms of an index called Index of Demographic Performance.
All right. So you touch upon the political concerns that the two chief ministers seem to have behind their suggestion. But I also wanted to discuss the aspect of the fast pace of aging that we are seeing in southern states. You talk about the north-south divide. Can you share some numbers and data with us to show the scale and the pace of aging in different parts of the country?
You see, the scale and pace of aging formally is actually measured in terms of proportion of population aged. The proportion of population aged across Indian states from south to the north are of the kind where actually the proportion will change between 2021 and 2036 at a different pace. If I put for you in 2021, Bihar seems to be having a proportion of aged population 7.7%, as against India's 10.1%, as against if you take southern states like Tamil Nadu or Kerala, the proportion will be even from national average. It is higher. It is about suppose 16.5% in Kerala. 16.5% in Kerala, 13.7% in Tamil Nadu. So obviously this pattern of 2021, when it is projected to 2036, that reveals to us the pace of aging. And that pace of aging itself shows that the southern states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu within 15 years' time would actually increase their share of elderly population in Tamil Nadu from 13.7 to 20.8 and in Kerala from 16.5 to 22.8. So these space, when you compare with the states which like Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, which stand at 7.7% in 2021, will be reaching in 2036 to 11% only. So definitely the pace of aging in northern or the states where there is high fertility is much more lower. And I would say this pace of aging is not primarily or wholly due to reduction in fertility levels, but increasing longevity. There is a differential increase in longevity, and the longevity increase in southern states are significantly better than the states which we are talking about, whose pace of aging is slower.
All right. Thanks for sharing those numbers with us, Uday. Geeta, let me come to you, and I want to understand whether this sort of rapid aging is it a cause for worry, In other words, is aging necessarily a bad thing, or is it part of a natural progression in how a population changes over time? And what should we really worry about?
So, thanks very much for the question, Jagriti. What's to worry about aging? And is it something to worry about at all? Well, look, as human beings or as any biological species, you're going to be born and you're going to die. And somewhere in between, you're going to age. So, in that sense, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and is it part of a natural progression? For the individual human being, it is part of natural progression. If one lives long enough, one will spend some part of one's life being aged. The question, however, is when you think of the population of a state or of a country, and there, different kinds of development approaches, policies towards population, policies towards fertility play a big role in whether aging is something to worry about and whether aging is something to handle and how to handle. What we should really worry about are, in fact, a whole range of development and social factors, health factors. As a population grows older, non-communicable diseases, heart issues, blood pressure issues, cancers, and so on, become the incidence of those increase with aging. And those, as we know, NCDs, as we call them, require a very, very different approach to prevention and treatment than infectious diseases do. So one thing we have to be concerned about is the NCD incidence and prevalence in the population. Second question is jobs. What kind of work is going to be possible for an older population to do? Now, that, of course, runs up against a huge range of issues that have to do with the big changes in technology that are happening. And as the economy becomes more and more IT linked, in fact, physical strength, musculature, as we know over time, have become less and less critical. So it does mean that in terms of work, the kind of work that an older population can do is fairly well in sync with the kind of technology transformations that we see happening. There are other elements that I can discuss a bit later, which have to do with how one handles migration and how one handles gender inequality and care services, which are critical, whether a population is aged or very young. So I think I'll stop with that and maybe come back a bit later.
Interesting, Gita. I have a follow up question to that. So, there are often concerns that with a rapidly aging population, you also have diminishing working population, but you are suggesting that that may not necessarily be the case if we are able to devise policies, to address some of these challenges.
Worldwide, the approach to aging has been changing. And there's a lot of discussion now about the third stage of aging versus the fourth stage of aging, all of which have to do with how an older population can contribute, can thrive in relation to the society that they live in. And I do believe that we need to pay significant attention to those. It means that, for instance, let's take health. I talked about NCDs earlier. When a population is very small, if you have a lot of babies, you have to think about immunization and you have to think about polio eradication. Not so for an older population. You have to think about preventing cardiac arrests. You have to think about how the population can be healthy, can thrive. And those things, as I'm saying, as technology is changing, is moving towards becoming less dependent on physical musculature and strength, may actually not be such a bad thing in terms of older people and their ability to do things. Of course, when you get very old populations, you have other issues such as dementia and Parkinson's and so on. But dementia increasingly is something on which a lot of research is being done globally. And I think we're going to see a lot of breakthroughs in dementia prevention in the next decade or so. So that would mean that your older population doesn't need to be, Salman Khan in terms of muscles, nor does it have to lose its mental acuity as it ages.
Okay. The way technology is changing, we do see that, for instance, in my own family with my parents, the way they struggle with technology. And of course, everybody has their own different aptitude and how they adapt with technology. It's not easy for a lot of people to, adapt very quickly.
You're absolutely right. And part of that is because we actually have very few services for older people. I have 90 plus aunts, 90 plus aged aunts who are perfectly zippy on WhatsApp, who are excellent at doing embroidery, who can do all kinds of things. But that means that we have to have an approach to aging, which is the contribution of older people, the possibility of older people to thrive. And we don't have anything like that approach. We have to stop seeing aging as purely a burden and a cost. And we have to start thinking of aging as a contribution. We all love to say, we love older people because they are wiser, they have more experience. But we don't really think of them as productive. We don't think of them as creative. And in fact, they can be productive and creative, both.
Yes, fascinating. I mean, that would require a massive mindset change. Now, just moving on from this, Uday, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned how longevity improved in southern states. So what are the factors that's responsible for, rapid aging? Was it because of social development factors in southern states that led to curtailment of fertility rate and improved mortality, or there are other reasons?
Yeah, before I come to this question, I just wanted to add few lines to this pessimistic outlook of aging. In fact, the
Yeah.
pessimistic outlook of aging is primarily because of the reading of aging in a static way than a dynamic way. Because the dynamic
Yeah.
reading of aging actually sees that what are the expected years of life. Your cutoff to consider somebody aged should be moving upward. That is one. Second, the characteristics of the future elderly could be very different from the present elderly. Okay, therefore, this outlook that we are discussing about, we must keep in mind that the stock about whom we are thinking in numbers as bigger, we must also take their characteristics into account before assessing, as Gita rightly puts it, that all of them are not to be seen as unproductive, or all of them are not to be seen as a burden that they cannot be made use for. Coming to the fact that what you just now raised, that what is responsible for the faster aging process in southern states than in northern states, they're partially perhaps indicative of the fact that the levels of fertility has actually gone down, and the measurement that we are doing is in terms of the age structure. Here, age structure, if the younger population share goes down, it ought to show in an increase in the older population share. Therefore, that is not something which is primarily because there is big difference in terms of longevity gains. Longevity gains definitely has been slightly higher in southern states than northern states, but this proportion on which we measure aging, that is conditioned by the lower level of fertility, smaller number of children, the 0 to 14 population being smaller. Therefore, the proportion elderly shows a kind of a magnitude or a share which is quite different, and it moves much faster. As I just gave you statistics, within few years, and its doubling time also is much more quicker than it will happen in the northern states. So that is the account of difference. However, longevity gain is not something which is not happening in the northern states. The longevity gain needs an inspection in terms of the expected life years of those who are old. If you look at that difference, then definitely a 70-year-old's expectation of life in northern state and a 70-year-old expectation of life in southern state is widely different. Therefore, it is not about just elderly population, but in terms of longevity gain in elderly years of life has been significantly different in southern states. And that's something which needs to be noted.
All right, interesting. You mentioned lower fertility, and Gita, I wanted to ask you, therefore, is having more babies, as suggested by the two chief ministers, a solution for southern states, or is that fraught with its own sets of dangers?
You know, I wish in the field of population, everybody thinks they can become an instant expert on this as though there is nothing really in a disciplinary here. And I think from the kinds of things that Professor Mishra has been saying and that I've been saying, you can see that that's not true. In population policies, we had a long period in the first half of our post-independence period, till when we were very concerned, population bomb, we're going through fast, all kinds of nonsense. That wasn't just in India, that was globally. As a result of which we tried different kinds of things which actually didn't work very well and which led to human rights violations, coerced population policies, sterilizations that were coerced. Now we seem to be swinging in the other direction. How can we make people have more babies? By the way, when I read at least I haven't read the Tamil interview or speech that Stalin gave, but the write-ups in English that I saw, I think he was speaking tongue-in-cheek. He was much more concerned to speak about the 16 forms of wealth that an earlier Tamil Tamil writer had written about. But I do think Chandrababu Naidu was probably much more serious in talking about incentives for couples to have more babies. We've tried disincentives for couples to have babies before. Didn't work much. Now we're talking about incentives. And the kinds of incentives that he's talking about are absurd. For instance, he mentioned, from what I saw, that you can only stand for local elections if you have more than 2 babies. Earlier, it used to be you can only stand for local elections if you have less than 2 babies. So if we keep swinging, and that didn't work, neither do I think this is going to work. If anybody thinks that people will make decisions about electoral participation on the basis of whether they get support, whether they have more or less babies, that's absurd. What happened when we had the disincentive previously? Any local strongman who had 5 children would simply claim that he had only 2 and say, those 3 are not mine, they belong to my brother, to a neighbor, to somebody else. Now, if you tell them you need to have 2 or more, it's very easy to trot out somebody else's child and say, these are mine. So these kinds of ridiculous attempts at incentivizing or disincentivizing baby production, I think simply are not effective, quite often violate human rights, and there are costs attached to them as well beyond these, which we need to be aware of.
Yeah. So I'm also curious to understand, what happens when agency is snatched from women, either when they're told to have more babies or when they're told that they can't have more than 2 babies or more than a baby. And this is something we've seen in China. And now we're seeing, agencies calling up couples and inquiring them about the status of pregnancy or how many children they're planning to have. So what happens to women and their agency?
You answered it in your question. Agency is snatched away from women, and especially young women, because we still are a country where most babies are had by women at relatively young ages. So these are for a democracy that believes in individuals and individual rights, to be part of a thriving democracy, are absolutely should be complete no-nos. We learned that during our period of forced sterilizations, that women's human rights particularly get abused and violated. And we need to learn that. It's much worse, I think, when it comes to forcing women not to have babies. In China, they went to extremes. Women were forced to abort babies because they could, under the one-child policy regime. But to force a woman to have a baby that she doesn't want to have, for whatever reasons that have to do with her own beliefs, her own situation, her own context, is more difficult to do. Because women, you can't sort of impregnate women and force them to carry the pregnancy to term. Those are the kinds of science fiction horror stories of the kind that Margaret Atwood wrote about in The Handmaid's Tale, and surely we don't want to have that kind of situation as far as women are concerned.
Okay. I also wanted to explore what are the reasons that young couples do not want to have kids. And instead of the sort of knee jerk reaction that we'll give incentives or we'll give money or we will bar people from local body elections, shouldn't government policies also try and understand and study what are the underlying reasons why people are not interested to have, say, more than one child or have no child at all?
Okay, so since 2015, if we look worldwide, a number of countries have moved in the direction of trying to have pro-natalist policies. They include a number of Europeans where aging is a major issue: Hungary, Poland, even Greece, and then Finland, Latvia. Sweden, of course, has had pro-natalist policies from earlier. And then we have Korea, we have Japan, and then increasingly more recently, we have China that now allows since 2021 everybody to have 3 children. So all of these are attempts to somehow imagine that if you have a bunch of... So what is it that governments try to do under these pro-natalist policies? They try to increase maternity leave or paternity leave. They try to increase child support or reduce taxation if you have more children. They try to actually give cash incentives for people to have children. For example, since last year, 2023, if I'm not mistaken, in Japan, they give the equivalent, they give 500,000 yen. That's roughly the equivalent of almost 3 lakhs of rupees for someone to have a child. Okay? But why doesn't this work very well? It hasn't worked terribly well anywhere. It hasn't worked because for young people, what it tends to do is if you are married and you are planning to have a child 5 years from now, let's say, you may, if you're promised an incentive, a cash incentive to have a child, prepone that decision. You may have the child sooner, 3 years rather than 5 years on. But you're very unlikely to make a decision whether or not to have a child, and much less likely to decide to have a second child or a third child. The reason is young people are also looking at things like, can they actually live with? Is there adequate housing? What is the cost of raising a child? What does it cost to put a child to kindergarten and then through school? Even in India, these issues are very serious issues. As we become a more educated country, in a context where the economy is requiring people to have more and more education, that's very expensive. So when young people can't see that, they're not likely to have more children. The other one is a big opportunity cost where women are concerned. And that brings me to the question of who's responsible for the unpaid care of taking care of babies. It's largely women. Women drop out of work. When they may drop out permanently, they may drop out for a short period of time. Even if they drop out for 2, 3, 4 years, when they go back, they will have lost their place in the promotion ladder, and they will not be able to have the kind of career that they were hoping for. So for women, there's a huge cost to having babies, which, given the way in which care work is distributed and the nature of gender inequality in most societies and very much in our society, it's unlikely that people are going to decide and women are going to want to have 2, 3 children. Think about the middle class that you and I know, that we come from. My grandmother had 7 kids. My mother had 3. I have 1. And I'm not sure if that 1 is going to have a child at all. And all of that has to do with the kind of transformations that we are seeing in society. And these pro-natalist policies do very little to change that.
Yeah. So there's the increasing cost of living, there's increasing financial insecurity at the same time. Yes. Uday, I mean, earlier you mentioned that there is population momentum, and even though there is this north-south divide, and in certain states, in southern states, for instance, we see declining fertility rates, and a fertility rate below replacement level in the range of 1.6 to 1.7, etc., for most southern states. But you also say that the population will continue to grow for quite some time. And I want to come to that, piece. Often, a large population is spoken of as a boon. And we know that India has surpassed China and is now the world's most populous country. And much is made of the demographic dividend that this will reap for India. We often hear international CEOs who want to expand their business say that the huge population of this country is the reason why they're interested to invest in India. But is India able to realize the demographic dividend, and what must it do to achieve that?
See, this whole concept of demographic dividend is making rounds for quite a while now, and it has been perhaps interpreted in very simplistic terms, in the sense that your working age population share continues to remain either increasing, or it is compared with other populations to say that you have a demographic dividend because you have a working population, or in general terms, a young population. I would say that this is not merely in terms of numbers. These numbers are not really the dividend. Unless otherwise, these numbers are facilitated with the required capabilities for them to reap in the labor market. And in case these numbers are not educated, kept healthy, I mean, they are made educated, they are kept healthy with proper nutrition, and also having a lifestyle in which they are productive enough to reap from the labor market. And that will be the realistic demographic dividend. Now, coming to comparison, as I was mentioning, why? Because population momentum, despite the fact that the fertility levels have come down, population momentum will actually keep the composition of this age structure quite stable for a while, because of the fact that while reading this age composition, one needs to read it in a cumulative structure. When you compare Kerala's population with Uttar Pradesh, in fact, some time back, I had coined this idea called how much of youthness lost in the population. If we want to measure, then the youthness lost is to be measured to say that how much ahead Kerala is in terms of losing youthness compared to other states. How are they losing youthness? And this can be analyzed by a cumulative structure, not by taking the total sum of what is the share of the working age population. When I say cumulative structure brings in the dynamics by which the entry into the workforce happens and exit from the workforce happens. Okay. So therefore, you know that what is the number coming, and the number coming along with what kind of characteristics. And therefore, the reading of demographic dividend perhaps would be more clear. But to apparently, what I want to mention is that there is a premature, hurried idea about the fact that we have already reached a situation that we can't sustain our population. That's not going to happen. As I began saying, that India is going to grow for another 50 years, more than 50 years. Okay, so this 50 years time is sufficient enough of half of a century to plan in a manner that we can sustain our population. We are not like any European country or something where the size is smaller, the composition is adverse, and planning anything can only be possible by replacing the working age structure by migrants. We need not have that kind of a situation. Therefore, I told my point is within India, what is the blessing? We have a demographic diversity. Some states are behind, some states are ahead. So, in terms of the sustainability of the population is concerned, we can always deficit regions can be compensated by surplus regions to manage sustainability. But the concern that has actually echoed this very quick reactions or knee-jerk reactions to say that we should reverse fertility quickly is not necessarily sustainability. It is basically in terms of federal representation. The size of the population is definitely going to be smaller when compared to the northern states. So in the national scene, the ratio share of southern states is going to decline. In that context, I was telling that when I worked for the last Finance Commission, we changed the population consideration of 1971 to 2011. There was big hue and cry because 2011 population share distribution, because till last Finance Commission it was based on 1971. So I was asked to suggest what is the way out. And the way out that I suggested made them moderate this difference by accounting demographic weightage. in two parameters. One is population size, another is demographic performance. And both of them counted 27.5% weightage compared to what was 15%. 15% were for population size, that is the share. Demographic performance is 12.5%. Therefore, what I would like to bring to your notice is that, in fact, this story will still continue to remain. People will still argue that how do we represent politically with a lower population size in the south vis-a-vis a greater population size in the north.
Yeah.
And in fact, in recent pieces that I have written, it is high time that we must adopt some index of equivalence, because mere count of size will not serve the purpose. Because mere count of size will definitely disadvantage the south vis-a-vis the north.
Yeah. So basically, quality along with quantity. What is the quality of your population? How healthy are they? How skilled are they? How educated are they? That should also be factored in, right, sir?
Yes, yes, of course.
Yeah. I'm going to come to you, Gita, for the final question. Professor Uday speaks about a plan to sustain population. And given that there are all these regional disparities, if we were to conclude what kind of policies are needed to respond to so-called population explosion in certain states and concerns over depopulation in other states, and what are the lessons for us from countries like China and Japan?
Let me start very quickly with a brief remark about China and Japan and then come to the really important part of your question. So, where should we be going with this? China, as I said, we all know one child policy, draconian, drastically brought down the birth rate. And then they started getting worried that their population was aging too quickly. They tried to allow a two-child policy in 2016. Didn't work terribly well. They've tried in 2021 to increase that to 3 children. And of course, we have to see whether that's going to work any better. Japan, interesting, very high income country, and they've been trying pro-natalist policies. As I said, they offer almost 3 lakhs of rupees for having a child. But a recent study by the Lancet predicted that the Japanese population, which in 2017 was around 128 million, is going to decline to just about 53 million by the end of the century. Okay? And the Japanese are doing whatever they can. Now, first big thing is I want to reinforce something Uday just said, the importance of migration. Migration across country borders, as we know, has lots of complications and difficulties because of our own cultural predilections. But we should be able to allow, and in fact, we know that there is significant migration within our own country. And I think we can move population. In fact, we see this in the South. Many, many, many more people moving to the South from the northern states, young people looking for work. But that's not just because of population, the difference, but because of development policies that actually generate jobs and growth. And social policies that actually support people who come in to be able to live and thrive. So the first thing we need to do is to pay attention to the fact, to the anchor for population-related policies. First of all, has to be to look at the human cost, human rights, and gender equality questions. Second, we need to look at their effectiveness. What will be effective, and how do we deal with policies to make them more effective? Not by coercion, but in fact by making it worthwhile in society. And for that involves financial costs. So we need, as I began in this podcast, to address the fact of what an older population is likely to need by way of healthcare, by way of making it IT savvy and able to take advantage of the changes in technology. We need also to recognize that there's a huge potential for trained healthcare, both male and female, in providing services for a changing age distribution for population. We've been talking in this whole, for the past half an hour about the aging population in the South. If you look at the availability of care facilities for that older population in the South, it's actually pretty poor. We have, spots, a little bit in Coimbatore, something outside Chennai. I live in Bangalore. You look for services for older people in Bangalore, it's pathetic. And there's a huge potential for trained, empathetic carers in that sector. And we know that we have a very serious employment problem. But we can't treat our care service workers as though they are cheap labor, piece rate labor. We need to really take care of our carers properly. And I would say that, and maybe would be a good note to end on. I said Japanese population by the end of this century is going to be 53 million rather than the 120 plus million that it is right now. From an ecological sustainability point of view, maybe that's not such a bad thing. We need to think about the planet in terms of what planetary requirements are likely to be. Not by way of talking about population bombs and that old rhetoric of fear and, I would say, neo-imperialism to say that, the former colonies are growing too fast, but in terms of really considering if we are headed towards, and I think we need to be, towards smaller population sizes and towards definitely replacement fertility, then we need to do that maybe that's not such a bad thing if we think in terms of ecological sustainability and of everybody having not a standard of living that is the standard of living of the grossly wealthy, which all over the world is obscene, but a standard of living that is decent, that provides people with a decent way to live, that provides work-life balance, that ensures gender equality is in fact becomes part of our societal DNA. So I think I'll stop with that.
Brilliant. I mean, so much to take away from this conversation, and we've really, shot over our time, and we will quickly wrap this chat for now. But for me, it's been a really enriching and fascinating, conversation. My biggest takeaway is how both of you have emphasized on a need for a mindset change towards, older population, and how older persons of the future will be different from those of the past. This is both very fundamental and radical at the same time. But thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. Thank you, Gita, and thank you, Udaya.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.